Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the London School of Economics and Political Science. I'm Mukulika Banerjee. I'm Professor of Social Anthropology here and have been here for 15 years. A special welcome to new students, to LSE, to campus, and our alumni. Can we see how many students are in the audience? Can we have a show of hands, please? Ooh. This is at Rory's request, by the way. So he did want to know who he's speaking to. So that's terrific. Welcome especially to our students. I'm, of course, very pleased to welcome Rory Stewart and Jim Walters to this event, and to all of you, and to our very large online audience to this event. It's a hybrid event, as you know. Rory, as no doubt all of you know, is former UK Secretary of State for International Development, the Brady Johnson Professor of Practice and Grand Strategy at the Jackson School of Global Affairs at Yale, a senior advisor for Give Directly, and co-presenter of that rockstar podcast, Rest is Politics. Jim is the founding director of the LSE Faith Centre and Religion and Global Society Research Unit, and a professor in practice affiliated to the Department for International Relations. This event is part of a series of events marking the 10th anniversary of the LSE Faith Centre, which works to build relationships and transform attitudes across religious difference within the LSE student body and beyond. I have been at LSE for longer than the Faith Centre, and I can personally attest it's been absolutely transformative to have it on campus. So we'll begin with a conversation between Jim and Rory for about 40 to 50 minutes. And after that, as usual, there'll be a chance for all of you to ask questions, as indeed I have a very fancy iPad here. Questions from online audiences will be taken as well, so I'll do them by turns, and I'll tell you to keep your questions short. So even if you're thinking about them now, think in short sentences. For Twitter users or X users, the hashtag is hashtag LSE Events, with a capital E for events as well. This event is being recorded and will be broadcast as a podcast, subject to no technical difficulties. So today, as the dangers of war escalate in our world, it is an auspicious day to have this conversation. As an Indian and as a Hindu, I identify two reasons for this auspiciousness. First, it's Mahalaya, which is the day when the 10-armed goddess Durga begins her descent down to earth so her devotees can worship her. That'll be held next week. The second auspicious reason is the date today is 2nd October, which is the birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi, perhaps more than any other political leader, thought about religion as a source of ethics in his politics, and has continued to inspire political actors through the 20th and 21st centuries. A nice LSE connection is that when in 1931 he came to London for the Round Table Conference to negotiate India's freedom with the British colonial government, there was only one university he spoke at, and it was at the LSE. He spoke at the Old Theatre. It was jam-packed full of students. Sadly, we have no photographs, but we know it was possibly the largest English audience Gandhi addressed while here. And he said something, the speech is available on the website, you can read it, but he said something there which seemed a fitting way to start today's conversation. In the way of nonviolence, we walk in the fear of God. So Rory, if I can just lob you the first question, though I want both of you, of course, to respond to this. When you think of your life of public service, and as we are in this particular contemporary moment, what do you see the role of religion in public life?
Thank you all very much for coming. I feel like a real fraud here on the stage. I'm very, very unaccustomed to talking about religion, but I'll try to work my way through it. I think the first thing maybe to begin is to emphasize in practice how little place religion has, certainly in British political life. Just as an observation of my working life as a politician. We begin every parliamentary day with prayers, very short prayers, and there is a chapel, and there is a chaplain. But generally speaking, religion features in normal political life, either in particular niche moments, for example, in debates around gay marriage, or debates around euthanasia, or debates around abortion, in which case it becomes a rather interesting form that can bind together parts of the conservative right and Catholic figures or Muslim figures in the Labour Party. So it can have these moments, but they're generally these rather rare moments of ethical, with a capital E, policy. Otherwise, fundamentally, politics in Britain is secular in all its assumptions. If you saw, I don't know why any of you would want to put yourselves through the pain of it, but if any of you saw the Conservative leadership candidates speaking today at the Conservative conference, you would have found that religion really, in any form, doesn't seem to feature. And that's broadly speaking because we are all living by two great phrases of the 1990s. One of them, the American phrase, "It's the economy, stupid," and the other a phrase generated by my colleague on my podcast, "We don't do God." In other words, generally speaking, what is happening in a liberal democracy like the United Kingdom is that most of the driving energy in the stuff that matters to politicians, the writing of your leaflet, your manifesto, your soundbite on your brief appearance on television, the moment where you stick it to the opponent in the TV debate, is primarily driven by a profoundly secular, materialistic conception of the purpose of human life and human nature. And it's all bound up, above all, in the thing that binds the Conservative Party and the Labour Party together, which is the big G word, and not the three-letter G word, but the word growth. And what you can see there is an extraordinary moment where the Labour Party has just come out of an election and has announced that their objective is growth, as though somehow no other government had been aiming for growth, or no other country anywhere in the world had been obsessed with growth. Of course, the reality is that for the last 40 years at least, every single liberal democracy has cared about almost nothing else. They have created these growth machines, their entire welfare states, their immigration policies. Everything is predicated on trying to generate as much growth as possible in the hope that through doing so, they can generate as much revenue. And in the pursuit of growth, the concepts of traditional religion are very much pushed aside. I could almost go through the words of the Christian Lord's Prayer, word by word, and explain how radical and offensive to modern political life almost every word, beginning with the word "our," is to modern political culture. But I'll perhaps stop on this and hand over to my colleague.
Thank you, Rory. I want to just reflect on how that secular politics that you've described, how it connects, or actually really is struggling to connect, with what's going on in the wider world. Because it seems to me that when it comes to religion and public life, but particularly religion and geopolitics, we're really in quite a state of confusion. Is religion growing? It seems resurgent in some places, or is it still declining like we thought? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And I think part of the confusion is that when people talk about religion, they're meaning different things, and particularly what we mean in the West is different to what people mean in other places. And it's a word that's evolved over time. So in the ancient world, religio meant the the commitments that people had within society, the rituals and customs that bound people together. And so it was a very political concept. But by the modern era, religions come to designate something more like confessio, a confession of faith, a set of beliefs that one section of society holds alongside others. And that's been very useful. It's helped us think about religiously plural societies, and it's helped us think about how this secular politics that you can describe can sort of contain religious diversity. But I think that's really under strain now, and we're in a moment where religio, in a more political form, is reappearing, sometimes in very extreme forms, as we saw in Iran in '79, as you've experienced in Afghanistan, and those examples around Islam. But then more recently, we've seen forms of religious nationalism across all world faith traditions. Mukulika obviously knows about the Hindu nationalism that's so powerful now in India. Ruski Mir, the Holy Russia ideology, is something that Putin has really tapped into. The Republican Party in America really sort of colonizing forms of American evangelicalism. But also even closer to home, if we think at the last election, candidates voting for, people voting for pro-Gaza candidates for reasons that will translate to other political opinions, but often out of profoundly religious convictions. And I think we're struggling to make sense of this and to engage with it. And to just, if you'll allow me a final word, that's really, the LSE Faith Centre does a lot of things, but it's trying to help us navigate all of this. We're building religious literacy so that students have got the ability to understand these situations better. We're building skills for leadership across difference so that they can transform these situations. And we're also helping students, I hope, think about their own faith. What they want it to be, how they want to understand it, what kind of vision it's going to give to their lives.
And I'd add Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar,
yes,
which we don't talk about much. I mean, we tend to see Buddhism as a incredibly sort of peaceful and constructive faith, at least in the version in the airport bookshop. But in Myanmar, of course, it was associated with these horrible atrocities against Rohingya Muslims on the border.
So how do you think that's come about? Why is it that these religious forces appear to be resurgent politically? How do you
it is a very interesting experience. I mean, it's something that I've very much lived through. I mean, I lived in Malaysia in the late 1970s. My parents lived in Malaysia, and at that period, we were very, very smug about living a particular vision of a multicultural, quite secular life that began to change quite quickly through the 1980s. I, as a child, went to Deepawali celebrations, I went to Eid celebrations, and there was very much a sense, at least in Kuala Lumpur, of people inviting each other to different religious festivals and participating in them. There was very little sense of people publicly proclaiming their identities. Very few Malay women wore headscarves in the early 1980s, now very, very common. And indeed, in Indonesia, where I lived in the mid-90s, again, there's been some very marked changes. On the other hand, in Saudi Arabia, of course, we see a strange countervailing feature. I mean, Mohammed bin Salman has challenged forms of orthodoxy which nobody thought he could do. I mean, the conventional wisdom on Saudi was that it's impossible for those sort of reforms to be driven through because the clerics and the religious right would topple the Al Saud monarchy if they tried to do it. And in fact, it's turned out he had much more latitude than people expected. The whole history of the 20th century in the Middle East is a very, very odd history of people being unable to judge where the boundaries lie in terms of modernization and secular progression. So Kemal Ataturk in Turkey pushes ahead with a particular secular modern vision, apparently quite successfully, but then Erdogan emerges in the 1990s. At almost the same time, we have the Shahs in Iran pushing ahead with increasing speed with a particular secular vision, which blows up in the revolution. In Afghanistan, we have Amanullah in the 1920s pushing ahead with a very radical secular vision. He comes to Britain, he buys Rolls Royces, which are the great symbol of British technology. He goes back, he sets up schools, he has a constitution where women are going to have the vote, and he's toppled in a coup d'etat, and there is a religious reaction. And then, of course, we have the same again played through in the late 70s, 80s. And potentially, you could argue, Ashraf Ghani Ahmadzai, who was the president of Afghanistan, great follower of Amanullah, to some extent helped to provoke the Taliban reaction through his own program of modernization. So I'm just complicating the issue further by saying that I'm not quite sure that we're in a unique moment here in 2024, that a lot of the history of the 20th century has had much more shifting backwards and forwards from religion to more secular modernizing agendas to reaction again. But I just returned from Afghanistan 4 weeks ago, and it genuinely is startling. Startling firstly because I found myself in Bamiyan, sitting with the governor of Bamiyan who blew up the Buddhas in 2000, and who's back again now today, having been basically living in a cave for 20 years, with a big smile on his face and one eye and huge festoons of weapons around him. But also because you can see the Taliban bring out tasers at Bandi Amir to drive women back from going to the waterside. And you can see Afghans navigating this in a very complicated way, because many of them have created lives over the last 20 years. Many of them are heartbroken for their daughters, for their sisters, and if you are a woman yourself, heartbroken because your opportunities for education have been cut off. You cannot basically now leave your home without a male relative with you. And that's one of the major things driving people to try to leave Afghanistan at the moment.
So your most recent book is about the problems of politics as you experienced it. It's about a number of things, but you discuss some of those issues. I wonder, do you perhaps see these problems as part of a global disillusionment with some of these modern ways in which we thought the world would be ordered, with democracy and markets and human rights and development and education and all of these things? It sort of sometimes sees in some of these contexts as if a kind of infrastructure of modernity was laid over something much more symbolic and cultural, and it didn't quite take, and there's been a kind of a disillusionment with Western secular modernity.
Yeah, I mean, I think the analysis of the problem is correct. I'm not quite sure that it leads all the way necessarily to religion. I mean, I agree that in understanding why we have authoritarianism, democratic backsliding, populism, a lot of that is a story of the failures of the 90s and particularly the 2000s. The 2008 financial crisis, the catastrophes in Iraq and Afghanistan, the rise of social media, the general sense that democracies are not delivering for their people, not delivering decent public services, not delivering housing for young people, not delivering opportunity, not delivering growth, not delivering a modern future, and a sense that authoritarian regimes, China, Singapore, UAE, Saudi, are delivering without being democracies. All these things are big, big problems for liberal democracy. Now, whether one wants to slot into that story and therefore the resurgence of religion, I mean, does one read Putin as you seem to want to, potentially as partly through the lens of somebody inflected by a particular Russian Orthodox vision of fighting Western materialism? Does one want to visualize Narendra Modi in terms of religious reaction, or does one want to view Narendra Modi in terms of populism and Vladimir Putin in terms of authoritarianism, how important really, well, not how important, I mean, it's clearly very, very important because it's absolutely central to their rhetoric, their movement, but trying to disentangle in these movements faith. And I want to sort of finish on this because there was an interesting article by James Marriott today in The Times reflecting on J.D. Vance. And the question he asks himself is, does J.D. Vance believe all this stuff that he's saying, and how does he believe it? And this gets to the heart of politicians talking about their religious faith. One of the problems with politicians talking about their beliefs is that beliefs in politics are very, very odd things. What politicians say operates in a language game of politics. It floats free of any actual reality. The sign and the signifier are snapped. Let me give you an example. When Ashraf Ghani in Afghanistan says, I'm quoting him here, every Afghan is committed to a gender-sensitive, multi-ethnic, centralized state based on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. What is this statement? Right? If I were to take him to an Afghan village and say, but these people don't seem to be committed to a gender-sensitive, multi-ethnic, centralized state based on democracy and human rights, and therefore, are you naive? I mean, did you not know this village existed? Or are you lying, right? Are you dishonest or are you just ignorant? He would be a bit puzzled because, of course, his statement, Afghanistan is committed to a gender-sensitive, multi-ethnic, centralized state based on democracy, human rights, and rule of law, is not an attempt to describe reality at all. What it is instead is a statement geared at British voters, at World Bank officials, at the latest IMF funding round, at the New York Times, at his own cabinet, at some movements. Ditto. When we hear politicians talk about religion, I wonder whether their statements about God and faith connect down any more than Ashraf's statements about liberal democracy connect down, or whether they too often are simply operating in a language game in which the sign is detached from the signifier, in which it would be quite difficult to gaze into their souls and really get an answer on, what does Putin really believe? What is the nature of his faith? And does it make sense to really interrogate the faith of Mohammed bin Salman or Narendra Modi or Donald Trump or J.D. Vance? I mean, or indeed many of us most of the time.
Well, indeed. I think that analysis is right, and I think both Mukulika and I would agree that there's a kind of hollowing out of religious identity as it's politicized and as it's harnessed by these leaders. And I certainly don't think Putin is a good Christian. I'm very clear about that. And I have no idea about his spiritual life. But I'm just interested in the fact that these narratives, these signs, as you say, are powerful, and that they harness them, and that they have a power that other kinds of narratives don't seem to have had. That just seems to kind of be...
Well, religion and of course, nationalism. I mean, nationhood is very central to what Putin's doing. I mean, he's not just talking about God. He's talking about Russia. And it's not quite clear, if you listen to Hezbollah at the moment, or you listen to Netanyahu at the moment, are they talking about Islam or are they talking about Lebanon? Are they talking about Israel or are they talking about Judaism? Right? These things are very, very bound up. And what are you defending? Are you defending a religion? Are you defending a border? Are you defending a nation? And what is it? I mean, at the heart of a lot of these conflicts is essentially my X right or wrong, my country right or wrong, my God right or wrong. And there too, I think that this question of pluralism is very interesting. I mean, I did a long interview with a campaigning atheist called Sam Harris, who likes to call himself one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And he used to ride around with Richard Dawkins, sort of bashing people up. And he conducted an interview with me in which he wanted to talk to me initially about a number of things, but quite a lot of it was about Islam. So I grumbled on the podcast that it seemed to me that we'd spent a long time, I think I said almost an hour, talking about Islam, at which point he got very angry on his podcast and said, no, he'd counted it and we'd only spent 20 minutes. So he invited me back again, right? Next time we spent an hour and a half. And I said to him, Sam, I'm not a Muslim. You're not a Muslim. Neither of us speak Arabic. Neither of us have read the Quran. What are we doing? This is ridiculous, right? I'm defending Islam, you're attacking Islam, but we don't know what we're talking about. This is sort of stupid, right? And he wouldn't buy into that at all. He wouldn't buy into that. And he also wouldn't buy into my attempts to say, it seems to me that you want to essentialize. You want to say there is this one thing, right? Here is a Muslim who said this, and therefore all Muslims must believe whatever this guy said, right? It seems to me, at least with Christianity, and I'm veering off, trying to pontificate about other people's religions, that it's very difficult to get back to a plural idea. It's very difficult to get back to an idea that there might be Islams or Christianities, that there might be many very different ways, and that that Sam Harris can't sort of pin it down by reading, whatever he reads, The Beginner's Guide to Islam or The Short History of Islam, that actually living the practice, this sort of connects to what you're saying, what am I supposed to make of the fact that the 10-armed goddess Durga is starting her 10-day journey today? Unless I'm living within a community, a practice, a temple, a history, a tradition that animates that and gives it some space. On the paper...
Yeah. You have to have the imagination and the faith, I suppose. Two things I just wanted to say. It's particularly sad that Ashraf Ghani is the example here because he was an anthropologist. And anthropologists, you would expect, would not have been taken over by World Bank speak as much as international media speak, but clearly that's what happened. But he was an anthropologist before he became president. The second thing, you mentioned all these different major events, but you didn't mention 9/11. And I wonder whether the history of the 21st century is radically different to experiments with the relationship between religion and politics. In the 20th century, your life in Malaysia, Indonesia, Muslim-dominated countries, but there's a syncretism, there's an exchange of ideas, it's possible. And with 9/11, and of course there are people in the audience who weren't born at the start of the 21st century, are something hardened, right? And therefore this Sam chap that you're talking about, the apocalyptic Sam, this kind of reductive representation, demonizing, etc., of Islam, that's become legitimate, right? Islamophobia was legitimized with 9/11 in a way, would you say? Yeah.
How many people in the room were born after 9/11?
There you go. Oh, if you teach in a university, you begin to realize this.
It is amazing, isn't it? It really is incredible. And I think, I remember contributing to a book called The Day That Changed Everything. And it was a series of awkward essays that we wrote about how 9/11 had changed the world. I now increasingly see it as a non-date, as the sort of dog that didn't bark. For me, the catastrophe of the 2003 Iraq invasion, the 2008 financial crisis, the 2003-04 founding of Twitter and Facebook, China's joining of the World Trade Organization in 2001, the election of Narendra Modi in 2014, the election of the Law and Justice Party in Poland in 2015, Brexit referendum in 2016, the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil in 2018, the election of Donald Trump in 2016. These are the dates, not 9/11. Despite the fact that I spent the next 10 years of my life after 9/11 completely absorbed in the world of Iraq and Afghanistan and this whole thing. But of course I have a vested interest in this because I thought that by focusing too much on this event, it drove the West into these very, very wasteful, brutal conflicts, that we have a tendency to just load significance on things. You know, this happened, and therefore we are compelled to, and anybody who doesn't come along with us after this happened is an appeaser and is Chamberlain, and this is Hitler, and we need to go get him now, right? And I think it's so difficult, this, right? Because even with Russia-Ukraine, I think Putin is doing something very terrible. But I still want to pull back from the sort of world-ending rhetoric that so many of my colleagues want to. You know, if I really follow through, what would happen if he took Ukraine? Is it exactly the same as the Second World War? Probably not. Now, that's not to say it isn't of immense significance, but there is a sense of inflationary rhetoric. There's a sense that everything is always built up to being the Second World War, basically. Everything is the Second World War, yeah.
I'm often told I talk about religion in two negative terms, and as people might guess from what I'm wearing around my neck, I do think that religion is a very positive thing as well. And so I wonder if we can sort of shift a bit to talking about the positive, and perhaps to the domestic scene. Once again, you quoted your colleague and the line, "We don't do God." I wonder where you have seen religion contributing positively to political life, to civic life in the UK, your experience as a member of Parliament, with your constituency, and what value you place on religion.
Well, so I think one way in which religion is very important, and it's maybe, I don't want to put all the weight on religion on this, but politics is in its essence Machiavellian. Its culture is that the end justifies the means. It's become a game in which people basically think anything goes. And all that matters is success and power. And I think religion is certainly the single most powerful symbolic force in the world for a vision of something that is able to say no, that's able to say, we will not do this, even if it leads to power. And I felt that the best of my colleagues were those who were able to compromise, yes, because politics is about endless humiliating compromises. I mean, it's about endlessly doing things that make you ashamed, endlessly voting against things that you slightly believe in or for things you don't believe in, because it's a team sport and it's all about loyalty and it's all about your party and it's all about winning. But you also need to be able to recognize the moments where you say this far and no further, right? And that's why in the end, it's a profoundly religious figure, in fact, a saint, who is probably the most important symbol in British politics. And in fact, his brass plaque is on the floor in Westminster Abbey, and that is St. Thomas More, because More is a man who was very much part of the Machiavellian universe, a contemporary of Machiavelli, got up to all kinds of jiggery-pokery with Henry VIII and was one of the most sort of cunning and successful lawyers of his generation. But a moment came at which he said, this far and no further, I'm not doing this, and I'm prepared to die in order to hold to my principles. Now, the odd thing in our lives in Britain is we're not called to die. Right? The sacrifice involved in resigning from the government or standing up against your party leader is extremely small. You know, Boris Johnson did not put me in the Tower of London. He didn't confiscate my estates. You know.
Might like to.
And the stakes in the politics of the rest of the world are much, much higher. Right? The courage, for all their flaws, right? There are many, many, many flaws, obviously. in politicians in Pakistan, in Lebanon, but the sheer physical courage that people have to display is quite unlike the things that are called on you here in Britain. And yet we so often fail to make even the smallest gestures of principle. So I think religion is the key there, because religion is an incredibly important, not incredibly important, sorry, the central way of being able to give life again to concepts like truth, equality, justice, dignity. And in the absence of those words, or an inability to comfortably or realistically insert those words into democratic life, there is no democracy. There's no democracy in a very simple way, right? Without truth, there's no democracy, because if the politician lies to you in their manifesto, you have no basis on which to vote. I mean, you literally don't know who to vote for because you haven't been given any information. If they lie to you at the dispatch box, you're not able to hold them accountable because you have no information on what they're actually doing, right? So truth is central to the citizen's ability to vote, control. Equality is central to the whole system, because the entire system is predicated on the idea that we are all equal, and that's why we all have the same vote. Right? That's the answer to people claiming to speak for the real people, right, on the popular side, or on the technocratic side, to dismiss and claim the experts have the answer. Right? The point is that democracy is a very, very radical, humbling experience. It's about the politician acknowledging that they are in a process of equality, but finally, and I'll finish my pontification here, that they're in a policy not just of mobilizing their base, but of attempting to persuade, of attempting to, in a non-patronizing sense, explain, educate, draw over, bring people across. And that contains within it the possibility of persuasion, an acknowledgement of other people's worth, an acknowledgement of other people's dignity. So yes, I think part of the problem of modern liberal politics is that those foundational stones were developed within a religious context which is dissolving. And as those foundations go, those stones crumble and it becomes quite difficult to sustain the system.
And I wonder if that might also have some implications for the university. I really enjoyed your series on Radio 4 about ignorance. And it seemed to me to be asking some really challenging questions about what is knowledge, what is truth beyond data and knowledge. And you've got lots of young people in front of you who come to university to acquire as much knowledge as they can. And I wonder what from the experience of making that series and your motivation in doing so, what else do you think they need to grasp?
Well, I mean, I think one simple thing, which was I tried to touch on the series to grasp, is how little any of us know. I mean, how peculiar the whole setup is. If I was made Secretary of State for Health tomorrow, I would be dealing with a system that I could not begin to understand. There are 350 million GP appointments a year. So when somebody comes to me to talk to me about something that's gone wrong in their GP appointment, how do I know whether this is representative of the 350 million appointments happening every year? Right? How am I supposed to understand a workforce of 1.2 million people? It's pretty difficult managing a couple of hundred people, managing 1.2 million people. Bigger, right? In other words, scale and complexity is a problem. Our societies are much, much bigger, much more complex than we ever want to acknowledge. And we engage in an extraordinary act of dishonesty here, where the politician wants to get elected, so they want to give the impression they know what's going on, they're going to sort it out. And you, as the public, may sometimes feel, oh my goodness, the thing's so awful, I'm desperate for somebody who's going to pretend they know what's going on or how to sort it out. Right? So even the smart ones, right, even the ones who've read quite a lot of books, even the ones who've spent quite a lot of time doing it, and there aren't very many of them, but even them, they don't really know very much, right? But none of us know very much. We're all going to die after not many years, and we will die knowing such a tiny amount of what we could possibly know. There's a lovely moment in Tristram Shandy where he observes that his mother died, not quite being able to remember whether the sun went round the earth or whether the earth went round the sun. And there's a sort of suggestion there that maybe it may not have made a great deal of difference to her life whether one was true or the other was true. But this has a lot of implications. I mean, it's an implication of radical uncertainty in decision-making. It's an implication of radical impotence in leadership. And it's an implication of radical humility in wisdom.
Sounds like a concluding sentence. I'm so glad you spoke about politics, because I noted that in the preface to Politics at the Edge, you said you'd thrown out a lot, you'd written a much longer book, which had to be cut down. And one of the sacrifices was a discussion of the role of ethics in politics. So I think Jim's question sort of allowed you to say what wasn't in the book. I was looking for it. But if I may offer a slight footnote to that discussion of politics, Machiavelli, the prince, describes very well what you're describing, the politician's life, the Westminster politics, realpolitik, right? The earlier Machiavelli, the Discourses on Livy, in fact, talks about the politics of the rest of us, the public, as you said, which is precisely about realizing that power lies in organization, in collectivity, in putting pressure, in creating some moral basis for asking questions and asking for the truth from people in power. And my evocation of Gandhi at the start was precisely that. The British Empire had money, guns, disease, everything on its side. And instead of, what do you fight them with? There's no power. You're completely disempowered as the colonized population. But what you do have is the power of numbers. You have the power of faith. You have the power of principle. And you organize that. So your discussion of politics is one half of that story, isn't it? And in a sense, politics also belongs to everybody else. And I only raise this with you because that's the sense I got reading your book, that you were very, very aware that there was, your constituents who you were meant to serve.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's some. I mean, this is very interesting, and this is the subject of the professor's research. But it's a very odd phenomenon. I mean, the truth of the matter is, I'm representing 70,000 people in Penrith and the border. What does that really mean? And understandably, people would write to me and say, how can you speak to me? You've never lived on benefits. Absolutely, I never lived on benefits. But imagine 100 other questions. How can you represent me? You're not a woman. How can you represent me? Et cetera, right? And the same would be true for whoever was sitting in my seat. I mean, often these things imply that somehow if I were replaced with some other individual, that other individual would represent. Now, an individual cannot represent the experience of 70,000 people. Right? And my experience, of course, in Penrith and the border is how unbelievably peculiar and unique the experience of all my constituents was. So when I walk down a street knocking on doors, every door I open is bizarre. Right? I keep hoping that I'm going to be able to get a sense of the Cumbrian community. There's no such thing. Literally, I open a door, I wander in, it's a taxi driver. He says, oh yeah, where have you just come from? And I say, I've come from London. And he says, oh, London. Never been to London. And so I think, okay, I've got this guy's rooted in the soil. So I said, oh, where have you been? And he said, oh, well, I just got back from Tenerife last week. Then I go and knock on the next door, right? And next door, it's a small, sort of modest kind of council house. The guy's doing IT consultancy in Dubai, right? The next door you walk into, there's a kind of big picture of Kanchenjunga and sort of Buddhist mandalas on the wall, right? And the next door, it's a single mother working in a pub, but her child's in New Zealand. And by the time you've made it through 7 houses, right, you realize the idea of getting your head around 70,000 people is impossible. Now, let's take this room. I don't know how many people in this room. How many people are in this room?
425.
425. 425 people is a lovely number of people, right? It's an absolutely lovely number of people, and it is about the maximum number of people that you could imagine having any kind of significant conversation with. We're really pushing the limits here. This room is about the size of a battleship in Nelson's Navy, right? It's about the size of a battalion in the British Army. It's slightly smaller than the British Parliament, but it's that kind of size, right? And there's a reason that humans don't push much above these kind of numbers when they're trying to organize, because it's just about plausible that if I really concentrated, I might be able to learn all your names and a little bit about them. But if you think about it, in this room, there are so many different brains, experiences, imaginations, beliefs. So the question of harnessing it, and it has to be about harnessing it, right? Because, of course, obviously the other thing I discovered in Cumbria quite quickly is, firstly, that the population had never been so educated, never been so healthy, never been so prosperous, right? So that their potential never been so well-traveled. Their lives were completely different to the lives of their parents and grandparents. They had so much to contribute. Secondly, they knew far more about almost everything than I did, right? Obviously, the doctor knew more about the health service, the teacher knew more about the education system, the farmer knew more about things. But even if they weren't professionals with professional expertise, they just knew more about their area than I knew, right? They knew more, cared more, could do more about planning in their village, working out how to get broadband into their community, how to build renewable energy without alienating people, how to get affordable housing. So what are the structures to bring that to life? How do you make this room of 450 people more than the sum of its parts, rather than what it is, which is considerably less, right? What we actually do, if you think about the maths of it, is that we take, I suppose, 200 rooms like this, and we call it a constituency, and then we produce one person like me, speaking on behalf of 200 rooms like this, right? What a ludicrous way of doing things. And then we take those MPs, right, take 650, we put them in the House of Commons, and then we remove all the brains, independence, intelligence, those 650 people, and squeeze all that out of them too. And what we're left with is this incredibly sort of narrow dribble of horror.
Oh, you're really selling a career in politics. Shall we take some questions? Yeah? Okay, so we'll take questions. I'm going to take 3 at a time. Please wait for the microphone to come to you. I'll take 3 from the hall, and then I'll take 3 online questions. So let's start with the question there. And please, can I request you to keep them very brief and make sure it's a question? And can I also say, sorry, I know you all have your burning question for Rory Stewart, but it is a themed event, so try and keep it to what we're talking about today. Thank you.
No pressure. Hi, thanks very much. This has been very interesting. I'm Natasha Green, an LSE graduand and civil servant. I have a question for both of you on, you talked about kind of explaining and the role that religious leaders have in sort of persuading people. How do you feel they're doing that to tackle climate change, considering it is going to be one of the most sort of defining challenges of our sort of generation? Thanks.
Great. Can you keep your hands raised so I can see the gentleman Good. Sort of halfway down back in the grey jacket?
Thank you. One thing that you mentioned that British politics does not do religion. There is one exception in this. I'm an old fogey, and when I saw religion, nationalism, conflict and community, my mind immediately went to Northern Ireland, where it's an uneasy peace. And I just wonder if both of you could say something about that, please.
Fantastic. The red shirt. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Coleman Gabrers. I'm the president of the LSE Catholic Society, and I'm also a listener of the Rest is Politics podcast. So I see myself as British. That took a while because my dad's Irish. But I see myself as Catholic first, British second. Can you talk about the role of religion as a transnational identity and its role in British politics, especially with what's going on recently?
Do you want to take those three?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, I'll give you climate.
Okay.
Transnational identities. That's very interesting. And you see yourself as a Catholic first and British second. It's interesting. I mean, many Afghans say to me, you know, I'm a Muslim first, I'm Afghan second, I'm Pushtoo third. I mean, it's interesting. But how many? Can I just before I come on? Sorry, I'm going to be mean. How many of you would naturally arrange your identity in a sort of rank order? I mean, does it come naturally to your tongues to say, I'm this first and that second? Put up your hand if that way of talking is something you do. Huh. And is anyone brave enough to stick their hand up who has an interesting alternative to I'm a Catholic first and British second, a sort of another interesting ranking? Yeah.
I'm European first. I grew up in France, but I was born in London, so I would say European and British.
Very good, thank you. European first, British second. Any others interesting variants? Yeah.
I'm a Londoner first.
Very good, very good. Londoner first, British second. Very nice.
And there's a blue.
Yeah,
There's a woman.
yeah. Woman in blue, back, yeah.
I'm Nicaraguan, Colombian, and Catholic.
Colombian first, Catholic second?
No.
Equal. Equal, very good.
Nicaraguan, Colombian, and Catholic.
Very good. Okay, lady at the back, yeah. No, was there not somebody with a hand up? No, yes?
Slightly different in terms of faith. I'd say I'm a Catholic first, then a dogma, and then probably somebody who's a humanist.
Good, okay. Right, lady in white, yeah.
From an ethnic perspective, I see myself as 1 foot in China and 1 foot in England because I would say I can interact with Chinese people just as well as I can interact with British, so I'm simultaneously.
So you put two together, yeah. Other variants, yeah. The gentleman who asked about Northern Ireland has a variant, yeah.
I just wondered if they identify by their profession, what they do, what they study.
Yeah.
You're a student or professor
Yeah.
or a politician.
Yeah, well, you can imagine that, couldn't you? You can imagine somebody saying, I'm an officer first and a gentleman second or something.
Have you used that line before?
Yeah, hand up there, yeah.
I'm a member of my family.
Member of your family first, okay. And, yes, in Brown?
I go British first, Scottish second.
British first, Scottish second, good, okay, yeah, yeah.
I'm a brown Christian Londoner.
Brown, Christian, London. Do they come in rank orders?
In that order.
I'm Brown first, I'm Christian second, I'm a Londoner third. Okay. Yep.
I'm British, Italian, Canadian, so I feel like I'm all three and neither at the same time.
British, Italian, Canadian, all three and neither. Okay, yeah. Okay, this is really pushing you because we're looking for stranger and stranger variants, given we've had quite a lot. Does anyone want to take us into a different direction? Lady in green, yeah?
I would say I'm Bengali first, Indian second, because I feel more connected to my language.
Right, Bengali first, Indian second because of language. Okay, yeah. Man in blue?
Nobody's mentioning religion.
Human first and everything else goes in. Okay, and the press is just saying nobody's emphasizing religion much, which is interesting. Yeah. Lady in white? You're, sorry, Muslim before you're Romanian.
That's one.
Very good, okay. Gentlemen, yeah?
Because it's really interesting how everyone needs to try. I've never thought of myself as
This or that. Yeah. Well, I was about to come to you in a sense because I was about to see if there's we could get a couple of other responses from people who didn't say that they rank themselves in this 1, 2, 3 fashion. Okay, lady in purple, yeah.
So I was born in Sydney. I've lived here for 20 years, and I've just got my Latvian citizenship.
Right.
I'm nothing.
You're nothing. Nothing. Nothing, yeah.
I was wondering about class. Nobody identified as any of the classes.
Yes,
As
yeah.
working class.
That's right. Except for me, I had my insistence on my gentleman status, right? Lady in pink, yeah.
A creature of the world.
Creature of the world, yeah. No, yes, go on, yeah.
Humanitarian and a future prime minister.
A humanitarian and future prime minister. So good. So
That's LSE for you.
The only person to insert the future tense into their identity. Yeah, okay. I mean, of course, that suddenly makes the business of my representing you all much easier now that I understand that. You know, I can very much stand up as a single individual and be all of that immediately. Yes, I'm going to stop there, but I am very, very intrigued by these questions. And just very quickly before I hand over, on Northern Ireland, look, it's so difficult to work out what to say, except that if one were in this room in 1990, you could have been taking a course called Impossible Problems, and you could have been studying apartheid South Africa, Northern Ireland, and Israel-Palestine. And you would have had any number of people telling you that it was impossible to resolve any of these issues. Great experts providing incredible history and depth and accounts of communities, why this is inevitable. And I remember it when conflict broke out in Bosnia, Kosovo. All these people sort of came forward, had centuries of ethnic hatred and people drawing Orthodox and Catholic and Muslim on the wall. And the astonishing truth of the 1990s is that these issues were, to some extent, or some of them anyway, were to some extent resolved in ways that were unimaginable. I mean, I still do not understand how Ian Paisley moved from being the man he was in the 70s and 80s, and a man who's, and as a politician I feel this, whose entire political project and support base was about no surrender, no compromise, rejecting and standing up for the loyalist community, how he could shift to appearing with Martin McGuinness around the world with a big smile on his face. And that's why I have still hope for these other conflicts. But I do come back to Seamus Heaney's insight in The Cure of Troy, which is that sometimes the resolution of these things appears to require a belief in miracles. I mean, there's something about these resolutions which doesn't appear to be determined by what we knew of the weeks and months that preceded them.
Can I also request that, Rory, you take the question about climate change? Because it's, this generation is taking the lead on discussions on climate change, right? And it requires each one of us, and certainly they're showing the way, of making ethical choices, which often are not drawn from religion, but they are deeply thinking about ethics. So did you want to say something to that question?
Can I let the father speak for a bit, because I'm aware that I'm monopolising stage, and then I'll come in.
Sure.
You could have been a planted question, because the LSE Faith Centre is doing a lot of work on climate. It's not a planted question. And we're doing that work both on campus, so students who are interested in religion and climate change should sign up for the Beacon Faith and Leadership programme, where we have a module on it, but also internationally. What we feel needs to happen is that there have been quite a lot of statements signed by the Pope and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar and all these kind of big high-level leaders kind of agreeing on things, but they don't seem to sort of trickle down. And so we've been working in Egypt and Jordan. My colleague Hanan Banerjee has been leading on this work to try and develop models where we can work with more middle-ranking faith leaders to engage their congregations in the issues at stake through the lens of their faith traditions, and to do that in dialogue and partnership with other faiths, in this situation, Christians and Muslims. We had a really extraordinary time in Cairo last year, working with young Coptic clergy, young Anglicans, and young preachers from the preaching school at Al-Azhar, to kind of develop this, and then we shared that model with diplomats based at the Vatican earlier this year as well. So I think there have been great statements from the Pope and so forth, but we've got to kind of get faith communities all the way down engaging with this.
I think you've taken the question on Catholicism.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I think I slightly I jumped the question on Catholicism by flipping your statement into the whole room. But let's.
I'm glad it came up because I mean, you were in the Cameron government that kind of introduced this notion of British values as sort of like a filter. Like, you know, you can be part of a minority faith community, but as long as you stand behind these values. And that seems to me to be a not straightforward exercise. It's not gone incredibly well.
No, it's definitely not straightforward. And I find it's one of my blind spots. I just can't do that. I find it very, very difficult to stand up and bang on about values and be profoundly sort of judgmental of people. I mean, I was the prisons minister, and my basic experience working in prisons is that, of course, many people in prisons had done very terrible things, and the public have a right to be protected, and they should be in prison. But on the other hand, that wasn't really, if I'm honest, my major experience. My major experience is that 40% of the people I was working with had been in care, 35% of them been excluded from school, about half of them had serious mental health issues, 6% had addiction problems. I mean, and they were from the very, 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 often the very poorest parts of society. And the question which my colleagues wanted to hit, which is, you know, values and rights and wrong, and these are bad people, didn't, in the interaction with them. I mean, I'll go further. I mean, I have spent quite a lot of my life surrounded by people who have very, very strange views about the world, about certain kinds of things, and who are also capable of immense generosity, courage, kindness. I mean, I remember feeling in Afghanistan that there were people I was working with. I mean, I literally walked across Afghanistan every night. I was looked after, put up, made it safely across the country because people accompanied me from house to house. Very, very poor people fed me, looked after me. But some of those people, in a different mood, in Iraq, people I'd eaten lunch with attacked me and tried to kill me in my compound. And they tried to kill me in my compound because I was part of a British occupation, because I was a Christian, not a Muslim. Do I judge them for that? Do I think they're evil for that? Not really, no. I sort of felt, in a sense, fair enough. I mean, I'm serious about this. I mean, maybe it's a silly thing to say, but I sort of felt that when I think about it, I mean, there's a lot of weird views out there. A lot of my constituents were very racist, right? I had Afghan friends who believed that apostates should be killed and had unspeakable views on women. I mean, and my whole experience as a politician and traveling around the world is that humans have very, very odd, strange perspectives on things. And that sometimes it's less integral to their character than we think. It's not necessarily true that the person who has driven a truck bomb into my door is everything that people describe them as being. Or that everybody who votes for Donald Trump is necessarily a wicked person. That we have, I mean, and I don't quite know how we get to this, because we live in a culture that's incredibly sort of simplistic and judgmental. You did this, and therefore you are a really, really bad, evil person, and there's nothing to be said for you at all, rather than the fact that most of us, in most of our lives, are surrounded by friends, family, relatives, who say and feel things which are often appalling without them necessarily being entirely appalling people.
Shall I take some questions from the online audience? So one of them, the first one is, what is the role of the Church of England in re-engaging British society with Christian values? And in brackets, Christian values as one of the foundations of British society. Shall I read them all out together? And then you can... there's an anonymous user, which is not ideal. We ask people to identify themselves. Thanks for your time. It seems we are living in an age of increasing isolation and social fracture. What role can religion play in addressing that? Should government also play a role? And the third one is from a student from LSE student from Albania. Questions for all panelists. In your eyes, would creating a sense of community in divided societies require that people give up on their beliefs and traditional institutions? And do you think the world is ready to do that?
Okay. Father, do you want to start on that?
With the Church of England?
Yeah.
Repeat it.
What is the role of Church of England in re-engaging British society with Christian values?
Well, I mean, the Church of England has to witness to what it is, which is the presence of the Christian community, the body of Christ in this land, and it's evolved its way of doing that into one that I think is very much characterised by invitation and hospitality and generosity. So I don't think we're here to hit people over the head with whatever might be understood by the term Christian values. I think we're here to show them, including in the role that the Church takes, and obviously I take very seriously, of enabling religious life within this country, which is something that the late Queen saw as central to the life of the Church of England, and which King Charles very much continues.
Thank you.
On the question of isolation, lack of meaning, and the role of government and churches in it, one of the challenges is that governments are no good at giving meaning to our lives, really. I mean, there's no doubt that the thing that really matters in our life at some level isn't just economic growth. I mean, what really matters in our life is having something to live for. But when governments try to provide something to live for, they usually do it by declaring war on their neighbours. So generally speaking, I think and this is me as a kind of crusty old 19th century liberal, to some extent I'm quite relieved when government gets out of the business of meaning, purpose, and to some extent even values, that I feel more comfortable when they are filling in the potholes and sorting out the signalling on the Piccadilly line, and creating the space for us to then work out how to shape the meaning in our life. But there is a problem at the heart of politics, and there is a problem at the heart of our lives, which is that one of the assumptions of politics, and that most politicians propagate, is that all that really matters is making this country better. Making the health service work better, reducing taxes, increasing growth. And the problem with that is that we all sense that the world isn't quite enough. And this is where religion is interesting. Because you cannot, obviously cannot, get full fulfillment and satisfaction out of a human life lived only on this world. It doesn't stack up. Our lives are very peculiar. I mean, we are like grass. You know, I could be Gladstone, and in 500 years' time, ain't nobody going to remember me. And, you know, we can do a great deal to improve people's plumbing and electricity and their shelter. And again, in 2,000 years' time, what does it really stack up to? Not a great deal. So the sense that there is something lacking in the material world, something lacking in the structure of human life, is the dark secret at the heart of politics, and it's there that I hand over to the father.
I think, did you want to say any more, Jim, or should we take some more questions?
Well, only on the last one, the notion that we can now create community by asking people to give up religious identities, I just kind of think, well, good luck with that. That's just not where we're at. And so the task is enabling plural community and having the kinds of conversations, the kind of sort of engagement with people's kind of particularities and peculiarities, as you described, that is honest and that fosters deep connection. That's the task.
Okay, let's take some more questions. So let's go right to the back, white t-shirt.
What would Jesus say to the Conservative Party?
Hang on, wait for the microphone. Or maybe not. What were you going to ask?
What would Jesus say to the Conservative Party leadership candidates?
Okay, on message, please. Never mind. Yes, should we take a couple more because there are lots of questions.
Yeah.
In the blue cardigan.
Thank you. Would you think that secularism can be an elite project?
Think what can be an elite project, I'm sorry?
Secularism.
Secularism can be an elite.
Secularism.
Yeah, can be an elite project. Okay, thanks.
And that, the gentleman by the wall in the dark suit.
So one of the things that you talked about was kind of extreme religious ideology. And I guess in the past few weeks, during the course of the year, the Israel and Palestine conflict has been one of the biggest global events. And that's a conflict which has deep ties to religion and has often been exacerbated by extreme religious ideology. So in the long term, what do you think is kind of the solution with dealing with those types of groups that have that ideology and kind of confronting them?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so on the question of what would Jesus say to the Conservative Party, Conservative Party leadership candidates, look, I suspect he would have some pretty challenging words to say, not just to them, but to all of us. It's quite tempting to imagine that he's a guy who's basically okay with the way things are, but thinks the Tories are a bit much, right? My suspicion is that his perspective on the world is so much more radical and disturbing and peculiar, and so much more challenging to the entire way that all of us live our lives. I mean, his own life was so beyond imagining. If you think how he located himself in that particular Roman Jewish society and what he chose not to do and how he chose to end it, the sort of life that he would live in our world would be a rebuke to 70 million people, not 4.
I agree.
On the question of
Secularism.
Yeah, secularism, elite project, and maybe this question about Israel and its neighbours. I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, I don't know. Let me ask, a lot of students in the room, do you feel, says he, throwing the LSE under the bus, that the LSE has handled giving people an opportunity to discuss Israel-Palestine sort of okay, like 6 out of 10, underwhelmingly less than okay, 3 out of 10, or totally terribly 0? So who'd give the LSE 6?
There are lots of students here who've just arrived on campus.
Very good.
And
Okay.
are not allowed to vote.
Okay, all right, maybe it's unfair. Go on, just give me the 3 and the 3. 3? Yeah, and 0? Okay, all right. Okay, so, I mean, maybe, as we say, a lot of new students. I teach at an American university. My goodness, it's been interesting trying to work out how to have these conversations. I taught a class when we were in the middle of demonstrations where one of my students had been arrested by the police that morning. I had a seminar of 20 students. 5 came in with kaffirs around their neck. 3 came in wearing Stars of David around their neck. They'd been demonstrators and counter-demonstrators on the same demonstrations. And I was really moved by how well they engaged with each other. I mean, they were visibly upset, really struggling to articulate their words. You could sense how much control and patience was going into trying to be civil with each other, but they did it. And one of them then, somebody who'd in fact was thinking of working very closely with the Israeli government, then spent his summer traveling in the West Bank and came back with a completely different perspective on the conflicts. And I've been really moved by the thoughtfulness and the care with which some young people at least have engaged with this. I'm not sort of lining up for the kind of that this is a sort of great display of student ignorance at all. But I just say that to flatter you. It's all nonsense.
No, our students are fantastic. Yeah. Jim.
So from the centre, we've led 6 interfaith trips to Israel and Palestine. The last one was in 2019, and it's lovely to see some alumni actually who've come back, who've been on those trips. And I'm really glad you bring up the religious dimensions of it, because I think it's very important, and particularly since the Second Intifada, on both sides there's been a real intensification of the religious rhetoric, and particularly a focus on the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem. And I think people really, really need to understand this. Now, it's part of a very complex picture that I certainly can't begin to solve. But I'm always slightly bewildered when people complain about interfaith work around this issue as sort of faith washing, as if we're trying to. And I think it reflects what people think about religion. If you think religion is sort of being nice to people, then having an interfaith conversation about Israel-Palestine is really just a way of telling people to be nice to each other. It's not. It's engaging with what is most divisive, most contentious, most strongly held, and actually if we don't discuss those things, there will never be any kind of coming together on this.
Thank you. There are 2 questions here which you can think about, and we can take another one from the audience. The first one is from Kanan Farazi, an LSE alumnus from Baku. As you're being watched all over the world at this event, so as Islam is often... As Islam is often associated with political movements and conflicts in the Western media, what steps can be taken to foster a more nuanced and constructive understanding of Islam's role in modern societies, both in Muslim-majority countries and the West? That's the first question. And the second one is from Bo Martindale, an LSE undergrad, who asks, how would the panel suggest the government utilize religion to rebuild truth as a foundation in our democracy?
Well, look, on the first thing, so Kanan, thank you for calling it from Baku. I mean, essentially, it's just important to try to get people to engage with the reality of hundreds of millions of Muslims around the world and how different people's experiences are and how various and different people's identities are. I mean, the fundamental problem seems to me to be this stereotyping, this attempt to say, this is a Muslim. Or this is, whoever, right? I mean, it doesn't matter who's at the end of that thing. But all I can try to do is to say your description of a Muslim does not sit with the people that I grew up with in Malaysia or worked with in Indonesia or who looked after me in Afghanistan or who I worked with in Iraq or who I lived with in Jordan. I've just come back from Jordan. And then, of course, the answer is, oh, yes, well, I mean, okay, but you probably met some strange kind of Muslims. But the real Muslim, right, is something else, right? I don't know how we get to this, and I think this is something that I need to work out where I'm going to, and maybe somebody in the room can help me, because this is very inarticulate. But I don't think it's helpful to say that this is a perversion of Islam, right? That this is a kind of good Muslim and this is a bad Muslim, particularly for non-Muslims to say that. I think it's very, very strange. But I think even for Muslims to say it, it's a little bit strange, right? I think we need to understand ourselves more. We need to understand how our own societies, including Christian societies, contain multitudes of different people. You know, you walk around the United States and you go from the Mormon to the Baptist. There are people with some very interesting views of the world, right? But we don't say every one of these defines what a Christian is to the world, right? It is about trying to encourage people to meet people, to see diversity, to relate, to have a sense that you can no more say this is a Muslim than you can say this is an LSE student. I mean, we're just playing out here that there isn't an LSE student. There are 400 different individuals, and it's not helpful to stereotype and label in that way.
I really agree with that point. And the religious literacy work that we do, we talk about religious imaginations. So like a religion is a sort of set of symbols and ideas, a framework, a lens through which you see the world, and people are going to take that in different directions, different interpretations of it. And I also think that this kind of taking responsibility for those within a tradition who we feel are on the fringe is quite important. I think, you know, as we've said, it's across all the traditions, and we need the ability to say, we think that interpretation is wrong, and this is why, and have those conversations internally, rather than extremism be something that government designates and regulates.
No, and I have to say the work that the Faith Centre is doing on campus is precisely important because of this. It's often the only occasion when students are able to talk about religious ideas with people of other religions and actually try and have a dialogue, find a language for it. It often, in other spaces, there isn't that possibility. I'm very aware that I've been rather right-leaning on this occasion, so I feel like I need to take one more question. I'm sorry. Gosh, the pressure's on. I will choose a woman. I'm sorry. Always, when in doubt, I'll let you have it.
Thank you so much. You've spoken a lot about how culturally diverse we all are in this room and within the UK as well. People have very different religious opinions and clashing opinions. Do you think it's possible to avoid like a tyranny of the majority within a representative democracy when you represent so many people?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously a liberal democracy needs to balance majority representation with the protection of minority rights. And of course, the problem is it's very easy to say and it's very difficult to do because those are contradictory ideas in a sense. There's a paradox or a tension built into it. You want to say, I won the election and therefore I get to do what I want. And the question of what the limits are to what a government elected by a majority can do is the absolute foundations of liberal life. It's the foundations of our Constitution. It's the foundations of our protection. And it's quite difficult because you have to relive it again and again, right? You know, for example, one of the things that really angered me about David Cameron is David Cameron was really keen to make sure that prisoners couldn't vote. I think prisoners should be able to vote because I think it's a fundamental principle of our democracy that we're all equal and we all have a vote, whatever we've done, right? We have a vote. But making those kinds of arguments, making the arguments in Austria, where 800,000 people who are Austrian residents and have been living there for decades still don't get to vote because they were not originally ethnically Austrian. I mean, these are difficult conversations, and this is where, to flatter first one of my co-speakers than the other, the professor's metaphor, it's not only a metaphor, but the metaphor of democracy as agricultural practice, of nurturing, of tending soil is very, very important. That this is not a state achieved, but it's an activity lived. And it's an activity lived in common. And an activity that needs to be lived in common with an ever more vibrant, intelligent, peculiar, unexpected population. And we need to discover new structures. I think we need to change electoral systems. We need to harness citizens' assemblies. We need to learn from what Taiwan has been doing around digital democracy. There are so many things we could do to try to make this thing work, but it's a continual project. There is a sense of a tradition. There's a sense that what we are in the business of doing is trying. And finally, to sort of pay tribute to the father. I mean, I think the basic insight here that in the absence of a conversation about religion, so little of the world makes sense, so little of conflict makes sense, so little geopolitics makes sense, but more profoundly, religion is such a powerful way of discussing the two fundamental questions in our lives, our ethical frameworks and the meaning that we attach to this existence. So I'm very, very grateful that you've had me. Back to them.
That's a wonderful summary. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you to the online audience and to all of you. Thank you. Have a good night.